It's time to go. Okay. Welcome back. I hope you had a good weekend. I had a good weekend. I had 4 students already go to fulfill the tree hugger assignment, which was nice. So they sent me pictures. If there's any more, you need to send me a picture so that you can get your credit. I had one student who went out to Mount Chilhowie and hugged a tree that was this big around. And I told this, I appreciate the effort, but no. No, you got to go hug the right tree. I had one student who actually, found the tree that was hugging me and took a picture of herself inside of that tree. Yeah, so it's nice. So, hey, get out and experience nature. It's a good thing. Did an organized ride for the Open Arms Care Facility down in Chattanooga. Rode with some friends. I was good for the first 60 miles or so, and then the cramps set in, and I suffered for the last 7 or so miles, but it's over with. So going riding again tonight. Yeah. I know you're all excited about that. Okay, we got a lot of stuff to do today. There's someone recording today because I wasn't able to make it to my class this morning because my wife had a surgical procedure, nothing serious at all. A surgical procedure this morning, so she's at home recovering. I had to be with her for that. When we left off last time, we were talking. Yes, indeed, we were talking. Let's try this one. Let's see if that one works. No. It works everywhere else. Yes. Oh, yeah. Go ahead and check in for attendance on Academy.
Open the app, it has their Bluetooth turned on, and should be connected to the internet. And we have to move the app open. So it's going to pop up.
Okay, yeah, from this point forward, if you don't have Academy on your phone, you are being marked absent. So just be aware of that. There's 5 percentage points hanging in the balance of your perfect attendance in this class. So you'll extra, okay, that's extra and above and beyond. If you get perfect attendance in here, that's, hey, you will finish the course with at least a 5%. And that's saying something. Okay, so get checked in. When we left off last time, we had finished up our discussion of the Greco-Roman religious background of first century Christianity. We're ready now to move into our discussion of the Jewish religious context. If there's one word that describes the Jewish religious context of first century Christianity, it's the word diverse. Just as there are many ways to be a practicing Christian in our own world, okay, you can be a Catholic, a Baptist, a Pentecostal, an Episcopalian. Just as there are many ways to be a practicing Christian in our own context, right? There were many ways of being a practicing Jew in the first century. We don't know nearly as much, okay, about first century Judaism as we should, and that's regrettable. But we do know some things about some representative sects, S-E-C-T-S, within first century Judaism, one of which is the Pharisees. All right, so we'll start there. There's 4 or 5 groups that we'll discuss. The Pharisees, the name itself means separated one, and it indicates someone who has been separated for the sake of maintaining covenantal purity, all right? A right-standing relationship with the God of the Jews. This was predominantly a middle-class movement. It's possible to think of Christian denominations and to locate them along the socioeconomic spectrum. If you think, well, where do all the rich Christians go to church? There seems to be a kind of a concentration of wealthy Christian believers who go to mainline Protestant denominations, the Episcopalians, for instance. If you think by, who's occupying the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum in Christianity. It used to be, all right, Pentecostals. Used to be. Pentecostalism was a movement from among the rural poor, is somewhere it really kind of took off. That has changed as Pentecostalism has moved on up to the east side. They bought that deluxe apartment in the sky, and things are kind of changing within Pentecostalism, but Pentecostalism itself is changing right along with it. I mean, when I was young, we were as poor as Job's turkey, didn't have a pot to pee in, and there was dramatic moves of the Spirit all the time. There was a message in tongues and an interpretation, testimonies about divine healing, basically every service. That has tailed off. And I have to think that one of the reasons for it tailing off has to do with, our purchase of that deluxe apartment in the sky. If you have no idea what I'm referring to, okay, you're culturally impoverished. Watch the sitcom The Jeffersons and you'll figure out what I'm talking about. Okay, well, the Pharisees, all right, they were a middle-class movement within Judaism. They had an emphasis on ritual purity. All right, cleanliness is next to godliness. Hallelujah. I agree. I can't tell you how many times I have been to use the facilities, okay, in the men's restroom over here in our building, only to observe young men come in the facility. That sounds kind of creepy, like I'm watching this. Not like that, all right? They come in there. This is being taped too, so they come in there. They use the facilities, but they don't use all of the facilities. They don't wash their hands before they leave. And that is something that would make Jesus very angry. Okay? He is concerned, all right, about matters of purity. You say, you're just being silly, Dr. Proctor. Yeah, of course I am, all right? But for the Pharisees, cleanliness really was next to godliness. Maintaining standards of ritual purity meant keeping everything in its proper place. Bodily fluids, for instance, all right? All bodily fluids for a Pharisee are to be contained within the epidermis. And in the event that your epidermis starts to leak, guess what? You have suddenly become ritually impure. There are things that are supposed to be inside you that are outside of you, and God is not happy about that. Of course, one of the things that Jesus responds to, dietary regulations was another thing. One of the things that Jesus, the historical Jesus, responded to in his ministry was this concern about ritual purity of food, for instance. He declared that all foods are clean. It's not, what goes into your mouth that makes you dirty. Instead, it's what comes out of your mouth that provides evidence of your own defilement. What were some of their unique beliefs? Over and above and in addition to their emphasis on ritual purity, there are some things that the Pharisees believed in which are going to sound familiar. For instance, they believed in a final judgment. We've talked about the theodical problem, the problem of innocent human suffering. We've talked about how many world religions attempt to address that issue by punting into the future. They're going to allow God to kind of sort out rewards and punishments at the end of time. The Pharisees, they followed suit in that regard. They believed in a final judgment. They also believed in the existence of angels and demons. They were unique in that regard. What is an angel? Okay, I'll go to the next question. What is a demon? Okay, which brings us right back around. This unfailingly happens. No one wants to answer the question, what is an angel? You go to the question, what is a demon? They say it's a fallen angel. And it brings you right back to the starting point. Okay, these are categories of beings, all right, that have become difficult for Westerners like us to talk about. We have our hands full trying to figure out what it means to speak of the triune Christian God, and then somebody wants to talk about demons, and we start, thinking that they're just weird. Okay. One of the things that made Jesus who he was his facility with casting out demons. Christians believe in demons. And we get that idea from the Pharisees. For all of our hatred of the Pharisees, okay, and the Gospels have done a good job kind of teaching us to identify the Pharisees as kind of Jesus' mortal enemies. But for all of our hatred of the Pharisees, we sure wind up looking a whole lot like them. We got this belief, all right, in the existence of these beings, demons and angels. Which is the good being? Angels, yes. They have beautiful wings. What's the bad being? Yes. We got our belief in the existence of these beings from the Pharisees. Pharisees also believed in the eschatological resurrection. All right. Christians, this is something else that is kind of peculiar in contemporary Christian society. We've kind of forgotten. We've been kind of infected with this Greek notion of the eternal nature of the human soul. We think that our ultimate destination perhaps is going to be that which would make Socrates happy. We talked about how when he died, or after drinking that hemlock, he pulled that veil off of his face and he told his friend Crito, we really ought to offer a sacrifice to Asclepius. Who was Asclepius? Yeah, the Greek god of healing. Because he regarded death, Socrates regarded death is kind of the final healing. That's not what Christians believe in. All right? Christians regard death as an enemy that's to be destroyed, and what we look forward to is the eschatological resurrection of the dead. And this was a very unique belief in the first century. The Greeks didn't like it precisely because they thought of the body as something that was subject to corruption. It imposed limits on people. It got worse with time rather than better with time. Newsflash, okay? It's all downhill from here. All right, you're beautiful right now, but there's only so much that you can do. Youth is a priceless, very valuable commodity. Who would want this back? Me. That's who. I want this back. Maybe not like it is right now, okay? Maybe a little bit leaner, maybe a little bit taller, a little more brown hair instead of gray hair, maybe a little better looking, okay? But this is the only thing that I really understand and can relate to, is extension in terms of height, breadth, and depth. I don't understand what it would be like to be, a disembodied spirit out there flittering around in the ether with gossamer wings, and so it doesn't interest me at all. And it didn't interest the Pharisees either. They also believed in, at this final judgment, that God was going to dole out these post-mortem rewards and punishments, and of course this all fed into their strategy for answering the theodical problem. Another interesting thing about the Pharisees is that they considered themselves to be Torah scholars. What is the Torah? Yes, the first 5 books of the Bible. It's the written Torah. The word Torah is variously translated. What are some glosses that you've heard for this Hebrew word? What does Torah mean? I'm thinking of a word that begins with L. Yeah, and ends with aw. Yeah, law. Maybe a better, there's a lot of legal content in the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, okay, which is the written code of the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There's a lot of legal content in there. It'll tell you don't drink, smoke, or chew, or go with those girls who do. You'll find that. Maybe not. But you'll find the 10 Commandments. All right. But in addition to that, there's also a lot of narrative material. So maybe, rather than render, okay, the Hebrew word Torah with the English gloss, law, it might be better to regard it as instruction. Okay, instruction, you can get that from narrative text just like you can get it from a legal text. But that was the written code. Now, in addition to that, see, one of the problems with the written code is that it's vague. It's just vague. One of the commandments, the 10 Commandments, is honor your father and mother so that it might go well with you, so that you might live long on the face of the earth. Okay. Honor your father and mother. How many of you, don't answer this question, have a parent who want you to get a major in something other than what you want to get a major in? Okay. You throw that particular rock in this particular pack of dogs and somebody's going to bark. Okay, I know that hits somebody. You really want to be, I don't know, an art major, but your parents want you out of their house at some juncture. And as a consequence, all right, they want you to be what kind of major? Engineering, business, anything but art or theology. Okay? You got to avoid those two. Okay, so, well, what do you do? What constitutes honoring one's father or mother so it may go well with you and you might live long on the face of the earth in light of that particular life scenario? Honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That's another one. Well, what does that necessarily entail? In order to kind of help themselves live in covenant fidelity with God in light of the vagaries of the written code, all right, the Pharisees, they developed a whole system of oral laws in addition to the 10 Commandments and the other legal restrictions in the Torah to kind of help them with this. And now over time, all right, these became codified. They were written down in the writings of the Mishnah and the Talmud. Very concerned about matters pertaining to ritual purity, very concerned about living in covenant fidelity with God, and that all kind of spelled itself out in a certain sort of legalism. Where was their center for worship? All right, they were centered, the Pharisees were centered in the synagogue. And that bode well for their future in a post-70 CE context. What happened in the year 70 CE? The temple was destroyed. Okay, y'all all need to be ready for that one now. Okay, I'm not going to ask you a lot of dates, but I will ask you, what happened in the year. What happened in the year 70 CE? Yes, the temple was in fact destroyed. Judaism lost its central shrine, and as a consequence, the practice of Judaism was thrown back on the local synagogue. Okay, that bode well for the survival of this particular group. In fact, a modern rabbinic Judaism, all right, they trace their roots back to the Pharisees. There's two schools within Pharisaism that I want you to be aware of. They're the schools of Hillel and Shammai. These are proper names of particular rabbis. Hillel, who was he? This is Rabbi Hillel. At one point in his career, he was asked to sum up the entire law. You got these hundreds of commands in the Torah. Can we make this a little easier? Can you sum up the law for us, Rabbi Hillel? And he did. He said this: don't do to another what you would not want done to yourself. That is the whole Torah. Does that remind you of something? What does it say? Okay, so that text, Matthew 7:12, you know chapter and verse. You need to be a theology major. Matthew 7:12, known as the golden rule, that constitutes Jesus' attempt to sum up the law. Now, what's the difference between those two commands? On the one hand, you have Hillel saying, don't do to another what you would not want done to yourself. Jesus, by way of contrast, says, do unto others what you would have other people do to yourself. What's the difference between those two summations of the law?
One loves you more than themselves, and the one that Jesus proposes has you doing good unto others, being true, rather than
Which is easier to satisfy?
definitely Rabbi Hillel.
Okay, Mr. Pig over here, he's got good arm speed. That's why he can throw the ball 90 miles an hour. Got good arm speed. Usually, people with good arm speed can hit pretty hard. I would not want you to hit me. Not with that arm speed. It might hurt a little bit. So, in order to keep you from hitting me, all right, I'm just not going to hit you. I'm going to leave you alone, okay? And we both go our separate ways and everything's hunky-dory. I would like it if all of you would give me $5 today as a thank you for preparing and giving you such a quality lecture. But if I'm to follow Jesus' advice, am I going to leave here richer? No. Truth be told, I'm probably going to leave here poorer, but some of you don't have $5 to give me in the first place, but yet Jesus says, Mark, you need to do unto others what you would have them do unto you. So does that mean that I have to give everybody in the class $5? Yes. Jesus' summation, I'm no Jesus, okay? And his summation of the law, because it's, all right, you go to the doctor, you're sick, I got a fever and a cough, he writes you a prescription. Take 2 of these and call me in the morning. All right, Jesus' summation of the law in the Golden Rule is a prescriptive moral command. He commands his followers what they must do. All right? Hillel's summation of the law, by way of contrast, is a proscriptive moral command. He tells them, look, if you just avoid doing this, you're going to be okay. And that's not enough in Jesus' eyes. Then there's Shammai. Here's a picture of the historical site of Shammai's grave. Whereas Hillel would give these, wonderful summations of the law, kind of boil things down to its simplest, Shammai, by way of contrast, was a real rigorous spiritual leader who had added line upon line, precept upon precept. And both of these guys were rough contemporaries of Jesus. So you can kind of sense how Jesus is perhaps responding to the traditions that come out of these two schools in his own teaching. Let's move on and talk about the Sadducees. All right, the Sadducees were religious aristocrats. What is an aristocrat? Not an aristocat. Something, I love cats. Any cat lovers out there? I want to write a children's book about my own cat. Her name is Miss Mary. And she's a city kitty. I want to write a children's book where she has adventures. We've just moved here from Houston. She's used to an urban environment. The only animals that she's ever seen are human beings, dogs, and other cats. But she starts going out into the woods behind our house and starts meeting all of these strange animals, which she supposes, all right, to be cats, because that's all she's ever known, but which are in fact things like, possums and squirrels and skunks. I think it would be good. So
It would be too.
the last kind of illustration would be, she sees a rat and she thinks to herself, that's no cat. And the illustration is like this, Tasmanian devil kind of whirling around. Maybe one of these days. An aristocrat is a wealthy person. They got that money. The money and the power. That's who these guys were, all right? They were religious aristocrats. They weren't middle class. They were the upper class movement within Judaism. They were political realists, and that kind of helped them enjoy their power and their wealthy status. They willingly cooperated, all right, with the Roman governing authorities, and it boded well for them. They had a pedigree. You know how these old money people, they almost always seem to be kind of interested in their genealogy. I don't want to go digging around in my family tree because I'm afraid of what I might find, okay? My father, sure enough, he was a Pentecostal minister, but his brother was a career criminal. And I really think that my father was probably the exception to the rule. But aristocrats, they kind of had this real interest in establishing their own pedigree. And all these wealthy people, they always seem to kind of be able to trace their family tree back to someone who was on the Mayflower. It's kind of what these guys did. They regarded themselves as the religious heirs of priests, a guy named Zadok, who was priest during the reigns of David and Solomon. Pedigree. Do we have genealogies of Jesus in the New Testament? Yeah. 2 of them, in fact. One in Matthew, one in Luke. More on that later. Unlike their Pharisaic counterparts, they did not believe in the existence or the validity of the oral law. For them, their canon was just the Pentateuch. They kept it simple. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's all that they held authoritative. They did not believe in resurrection from the dead, which if you don't believe in any sort of post-mortem, meaningful post-mortem existence, that might make you a little bit more willing to, cooperate with the Roman civil authorities, especially if they're willing to give you money and power in exchange. They didn't believe in the existence of angels or demons. What was their source of money? Well, it was the temple. Okay, they controlled the sacrificial system. They controlled the temple cult. And big religion was in the ancient world what it is today. It's big money. What happened in the year 70 CE? The temple was destroyed. Okay. Well, what happens to the Sadducees when the temple gets destroyed? They cease to exist. All right? They disappeared after the temple's destruction in the year 70. Their source of income, power, money dried up, and they dried up right along with it. Okay, third group, the Essenes. Are you familiar with the words liberal and conservative?
Yes.
Are those good words or bad words? Those are words, politically charged words which by and large have kind of lost their utility in our culture. They're labels that people use to kind of brand others as either insiders or outsiders. But there's a proper way, I think, to use the words liberal and conservative. I think there is. Now, the Essenes, they were kind of, the conservatives' conservatives. That's what it means to talk about someone as a reactionary. If you had your midpoint, okay, all right, which direction are the conservatives? Yeah, they're over here to the right someplace. Who's to the left of the midpoint? Those liberals, they're over here. All right. Now, who's in the middle? Centrists. Another term is like moderates. So you got moderates, liberals, conservatives, reactionaries. Reactionaries. They were the conservatives. If we think about the other two parties within first century Judaism that we've already discussed, it's easy enough for me to kind of locate them on that map spanning, liberals and conservatives. To me, the way I was taught to use the word liberal, it's impossible to apply that label to someone who believes in the existence of a higher being. If you are a theist, the farthest right that you can go on that map is moderate. I've had people try to tag me as a liberal before. I know that might come as a surprise to you. It did to me also. Precisely because I'm a theist. The farthest I can go on that scale is right in the middle, and I don't really even know if I'm there. Moderate. If we think about the two other groups, okay, if that kind of far left position or far right position is occupied by the Essenes, and we've got two more slots available, we've got moderate and conservative. Who belongs in those two spots when it comes to the Sadducees and the Pharisees? What do you think? Well, think about this. How many rich people do you know who vote Republican? I don't know a lot.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Usually, a lot of times they're Democrats. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats, we all know they're the
middle class.
The liberals. Is that right? Sometimes these labels, I don't know if they always fit. The Sadducees, they had money and they cooperated openly with the Roman civil authorities. I openly cooperate with, the governing authorities. I pay my taxes. The Sadducees were moderate. The Pharisees, by way of contrast, with all their concern over legalistic matters and maintaining covenant fidelity with God, they really kind of belong in that conservative category, and the Essenes were even kind of more conservative than them. Well, how so? What we know about these guys, we know as a consequence of a Bedouin boy playing around in the desert looking for a runaway goat. So what on earth are you talking about, Dr. Proctor? Well, in the late 1940s, there was a Bedouin sheep herder or goat herder who was throwing rocks, as a little boy, 12-year-old boy, throwing rocks around in the desert. Sometimes the goats it's hot out there. They would go in these caves to kind of catch some shade. And in the hope of kind of hitting the goat and getting him to come out so he could retrieve him, he was throwing rocks into these caves, heard a clink, went to investigate, and discovered these earthenware jars that had been filled with all of these ancient biblical texts and other texts. All right. They're the Dead Sea Scrolls. Have any of you ever seen the Dead Sea Scrolls? All right. Where did you see the Dead Sea Scrolls? In Israel. It's called the Shrine of the Book, right? Very interesting stuff. The Essenes, in all likelihood, were the people who were responsible for having preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's the entry to the cave where that Bedouin boy threw that rock, and all of these priceless manuscripts were recovered. The oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible that we have come from the Dead Sea. It was a monastic community, the Essenes were. Who lives in a monastery? Monks. One time I had a student say, well, the nuns live in the monastery. And I responded by saying, well, don't all the monks wish that was the case? Yeah, monastery it's an all-male group. They're a monastic community, lived out by the Dead Sea. It's called the Dead Sea for a reason. I've made that joke already. Qumran is where that settlement was. You had to identify that on your mapping assignment. They lived an ascetic lifestyle. What does that mean? What does that adjective ascetic mean? If you engage in Christian asceticism, one of the things that you'll be involved with is fasting, doing without food, for the sake of growing closer to God and enhancing your prayer life. I encourage you all to try that out at some point. It's hard, it's difficult, but the thought is, if you deprive yourself of life's luxuries, it may have the sum total of effect of making you more aware of your need for God. Those who live an ascetic life, live apart from the luxuries of life for the sake of serving God. They connect, their kind of Spartan existence with a form of godliness, and of course that has been embraced by large sectors of Christianity. They were a monastic community at Qumran, held an ascetic lifestyle. Their leader was a guy named the Teacher of Righteousness. We don't know who he was. We just know him by his title. That's kind of strange. But, maybe he felt like his own personal identity had lost significance in light of what he was trying to do for this community. I don't know. The Teacher of Righteousness. Some other things about the Essenes. They were religious exclusivists. Have you ever been to or visited, maybe you come from one of those churches who is just convinced that it's only Christians of their variety who are going to make it to heaven? That everybody else is going to hell. I used to feel that way, all right? When I was in middle school, I thought that God had called me to evangelize all of the Baptists. I thought, I've got to tell these Baptists that they need to become a Christian just like me, otherwise they're all going to go to hell in a handbasket, and we wouldn't want that. They were unconvinced, let me tell you. And my own thinking has changed dramatically. I've told you about that. But what it means to be a religious exclusivist, and this is part and parcel of their kind of radical conservatism, is they felt like they and they alone were the true heirs of what it meant to be a follower of Yahweh. They participated in ritual washings. There at the site at Qumran, there are all these large vats that held water, which became stagnant. All right, and irony of ironies, in their attempt to kind of clean themselves up religiously, they would get all of these kind of horrible diseases that wound up killing them, They also participated in communal meals of bread and wine. You ever wonder how Jesus settled on, take this bread, it's my body, take this wine, it's my blood? Maybe that association kind of came naturally enough to him through the Essenes. They awaited two Messiahs. Why settle for one Messiah, anointed figure, when you can have two instead? They awaited one Messiah who would be priestly, from the tribe of, Jewish priests had to come from the tribe of Levi, They awaited also a kingly Messiah who would come from the tribe of Judah. Christians, and this is the task of the author of the book of Hebrews, Christians kind of rolled both of those titles into the single figure of Jesus. And the question, for the author of Hebrews is, well, how can that be the case in light of these kind of genetic concerns or lineage concerns? The Essenes were just content instead to have two Messiahs. Some people will say that John the Baptist, Jesus' putative cousin according to the author of Luke's Gospel, some people will say that John the Baptist was likely an Essene, and if that was the case, the likelihood that Jesus was very, very aware of Essene teachings goes up as a consequence. Finally, the Zealots. So we've got, moderates, conservatives, we've got reactionaries, we've got Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. There's a fourth group within first century Judaism called the Zealots. Now, of course, they were theists. They believed in the existence of God, but all of our categories are used up. I wonder where these guys are going to go. They're kind of way over here. They were the conservatives. Well, we need more language. There's at times where our categories fail us, and they're failing us right now. They were religious and political activists. What made them really so ultra-conservative was their willingness to combine their own extremely conservative religious views with political activism. When I was your age and younger, there was this rash of bombings in the United States, terroristic activity. This might come as a little bit of a surprise. Certainly, 9/11 was a big wake-up call for our nation. But bombing and terrorism has a very long history in our country. In the 1980s, you can go look at, there was a lot of these abortion clinics that wound up getting bombed. Now, who was carrying out those bombings? What kind of people? Christians. Yeah, Christians. When I try to think of, who were these zealots? The rough contemporary equivalent, I think of, someone who would be willing in the name of Jesus, to open the door to the local abortion clinic, pull the pin on that grenade and throw it in there. If you can think about that kind of mindset, you're ready to consider, who these zealots were. They were political and religious activists, very extremely strict monotheists. Our God is the only God that there is. And if you are worshiping some other God, you are necessarily an enemy of my God and deserving of death. According to Josephus, it was this group of Jews that precipitated the Jewish War of 66 through 73 CE. And we all know how that wound up. It wound up very, very bad. With the burning of the temple, with the destruction of the city, with the loss of any hope for real autonomy. So the Zealots. Paul describes himself in Philippians chapter 3 as someone who was zealous for the law prior to becoming a Christian. He describes himself as a Pharisee of the Pharisees. What does that mean? If you've got Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots, if he describes himself as a Pharisee of the Pharisees, does that mean that he was a zealot? That he was willing to kind of take up arms for the sake of the faith of his fathers? Certainly he was, and he persecuted Christians. But he didn't stay that way as a consequence of coming to know the love of Christ, and that's, to me, that's pretty awesome. All right, questions on this? We're making good progress. ¿Tienes preguntas? Okay, they had an eschatological world. It's one thing that I do need to hit on. We've talked about Jesus saying before, if you're a king and you want to go to war against another king, first thing you need to do is take an inventory, right? How many soldiers do they have? How many soldiers do I have? And certainly the zealots, when they started to consider seriously revolting against Rome, they knew that they were outnumbered. But they thought that they were living right on the edge of the end of time. They had this understanding in their mind that God was going to inject God's self into the course of human affairs, and that He was going to do so for the sake of helping His covenant people, them, the zealots themselves. And so, even though it was clear to anyone who was paying attention that the Jewish revolt against Rome would not work, they thought, well, perhaps if we just get things going, that God will show up and help us in our struggle against our oppressors. And they were wrong. They were wrong. And I think that there's probably a lesson to be learned there. Christianity took a different direction. All right. Let's talk about defining gospel relationships. It's still not working. It works everywhere else but here. Sometimes it works in here. Sometimes it doesn't. We're going to talk about literary dependence and independence in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All right. What is plagiarism? Yeah, copying what?
Like direct text, like word for word.
Uh-huh. Without doing what?
Crediting them.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's the cardinal academic sin. It's plagiarism. We don't borrow from the ideas of others without giving them credit. It's a kind of thievery. All right. And the university, the Center for Teaching Excellence, has notified us all that it has this kind of software program that if you submit a paper to us, we can run it through this and it can tell us whether or not, what the likelihood of you having plagiarized is. Okay, before we get started, I want to make clear that there was no such thing as plagiarism in the first century. Sweep that off the table. In the first century, you could borrow from the work of someone else with a perfectly clear conscience, not give them, sometimes people, because of the separation in time, they don't perceive that separation in time between the first century and the 21st century, and they start thinking, well, Dr. Proctor is suggesting that Matthew and Luke plagiarized Mark's gospel. No, I'm just saying that they borrowed from it and that they didn't do anything wrong in the process. That kind of whole moral conundrum that we have is nothing more than a product of our modern copyright mentality. Plagiarism is indeed wrong, and you should avoid it scrupulously at all costs. But it wasn't wrong in the first century. Well, what do you mean, Dr. Proctor? Okay, I'll try to clear it up. Let's talk about what the synoptic gospels are. Okay, Matthew, Mark, and Luke collectively are known as the synoptic gospels. Well, why that particular word? Okay, let's talk, if you discover, okay, do some discovery about the etymology of the word synoptic. Okay, what is etymology? Yeah, the study of the root origins of words. Have you ever watched, the National Spelling Bee on ESPN? Life is replete with irony, okay? The National Spelling Bee on ESPN, they're allowed to ask some questions whenever they're given a word to spell. One of which is, can you give me the language of origin? And sometimes I've watched that and thought to myself, these kids are they're trying to postpone the inevitable. They have no clue. But yet they're going to ask all of their questions and it's not going to help them. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. Can you give me the language of origin? No, I can't. Sorry, kid. Spell up. Let's hear it. All right. The etymology of synoptic. That's a word that we can work with, okay? It comes from a Greek verb, synopsizo, which means to view at the same time or to see all together. View at the same time or to see all together. Right. In describing Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not John. John's left out of this mix. In describing Matthew, Mark, and Luke as synoptic, basically what we're saying is they all kind of see Jesus in the same way. There's a lot of similarities between them. All three of the synoptic gospels see the story of Jesus in the same way. Well, how is that? Okay. We can come at that question from a variety of angles. First of all, I can give you some statistical information. Anybody in stats right now? Wow. What do y'all think about it? Okay, you're again it. Is anybody for it? You're for it, not again it? Okay. My daughter took stats last spring. She managed. Y'all do fine. Statistical information. Okay, statistics can make suggestions. Matthew contains about 90% of Mark's gospel. All right, so virtually all of what you'll find in Mark gets repeated in Matthew. You say, well, big duh, Dr. Proctor, they're all talking about Jesus. Well, there's John, all right? There's John. Just keep that in mind. John is not one of the synoptics. Here's another factoid. Luke, in terms of its content, contains more than 50% of what you'll find in Mark and substitutes similar material for about half of what remains. Okay, so in one way or another, about 75% of Mark's content you'll find in the Gospel of Luke, whether it's near identical material or just things that are very, very similar to what you'll find in Mark. So there's overlap in terms of material or content. About 20% of Matthew is unique, meaning you'll only find it there. Most of that, or a big chunk of it, big chunk of Matthew's unique content comes in the opening and the closing chapters, in the infancy account, and in the post-resurrectional appearances of Jesus. So about those first two chapters, last chapter, accounts for the bulk of Matthew's unique material. About 35% of Luke is unique. Once again, a big chunk of that comes in the opening two chapters and the final chapter of Luke's Gospel. So there's a lot of shared material. There's only 3 stories of Mark's Gospel, about 30 verses. 3 stories, 30 verses of Mark that are left unrepeated. One is the parable of the seed growing secretly. For whatever reason, that doesn't get repeated in either Matthew or Luke. And there's 2 other stories, but a total of about 30 verses worth of Mark that is unique, that doesn't get repeated. So 10% of, not even 10%, 5% of Mark's gospel is unique. Now, it's possible to kind of represent all of this visually, and I'll get to that. But scholars use labels, these convenient labels, to talk about shared and independent traditions within the synoptic gospels. If something belongs, for instance, to the triple tradition, where do you think you'll find it? All 3, yeah. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Double tradition is a little bit different, okay? Double tradition within scholarship is a reference to those materials that you'll only find in Matthew and Luke. So only Matthew and Luke, that's double tradition. If by way of contrast something belongs to the single tradition, what does that mean? Well, Mark only, Matthew only, or Luke only. It's in one of the Gospels, one of the 3 synoptic Gospels, but no other synoptic Gospel. All right, what about visual representation of this stuff? Okay, You can find this if you are a visual learner, all right, and you want a copy of this chart, just go on Google Images and put in relationships between the Synoptic Gospels, and this will come up. But this is a visual representation of basically of what we've been talking about. There is a lot of overlapping material between these three Gospels, and there's also some unique stuff, and then there's some double tradition. And it presents this kind of picture that is suggestive of some sort of relationship of literary kind of dependence. So we've got the material, shared and independent materials. All three Synoptic Gospels also arrange or tend to arrange events in Jesus' life in a similar way. For example, you have the same set of preliminaries or things that lead up to the inauguration of Jesus' public ministry. I'm talking here about a discussion of John the Baptist's ministry, which will then lead into an account of Jesus' baptism. And then after Jesus' baptism gets narrated, then you'll have an account of Jesus' temptation. That's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's how they begin. Where they have common material, that's how each of them begins. After Jesus' baptism and temptation, he enters a prolonged period of Galilean ministry. So he'll minister in Galilee, in the northern part of that map assignment that I had you complete. Once he's completed with his Galilean ministry, he goes on a prolonged journey to Jerusalem, after which he engages in ministry at Jerusalem, in the temple precincts. He does something that gets him in trouble. He cleanses the temple. He confounds the religious leaders, makes them all mad. They conspire to kill him, and he does. He suffers. That's his passion. And then you'll have the resurrection account. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all arrange the events in Jesus' life in this shared way. You say, well, duh, Dr. Proctor. They're all talking about the same historical personage. Certainly it must have been inevitable for them to do so. Well, there's John, all right? There's John. John does not arrange events in Jesus' life in this same way. There are some similarities. I mean, he dies, is buried, and rises from the dead at the end of each gospel. Okay, but working up until that point, in John's gospel, things are very different. I mean, here in the Synoptics, how many trips to Jerusalem do you have? It's less than two. Yeah, it's only one. It's only one, right? Okay, Galilean ministry, then the journey to Jerusalem. Yeah, there's only one journey to Jerusalem in the synoptic plot line. In John, by way of contrast, Jesus is kind of constantly going back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Right? He attends the Passover three separate times in John's gospel. So what John lets us know, all right, is that it wasn't a matter of biographical inevitability that the synoptic writers ordered or structured the events in Jesus' lifetime as they did. It could be done differently, and in fact it was done differently. So this, when you add this on to similarities in material, it really seems like somebody must have been using somebody, but it wasn't a case of plagiarism. Then there's this, and this is kind of the clincher. There's a lot of synoptic similarities in wording. In the past, when I have been able to catch one of my students plagiarizing, Google is a very powerful thing. All right. If I've had in the past, and I have in the past, I've had a paper turned into me, and it really seemed like what was turned in had little to do with the actual assignment, but it was written really well. You know what I mean? One of the ways that I attempt to avoid plagiarism is I just ask my students to do weird things, and that helps with that. I'll try to find, within that stuff that seems too good to be true, like technical wording or things that just don't seem to, have been likely to come off of the, computer of a 18 to 22-year-old. And I'll go to Google and find it. I caught this one kid one time. He ripped off a nun, all right? This nun had written a piece on Paul, and he lifted this stuff straight out of Sister Papouphany of the Sacred Heart's website. And, I printed off all the pages and highlighted all the shared material. And then, I got to do it to him. I want to torture him a little bit, right? So I'm handing everybody's paper back, and then I come to him and I say, could you talk to me after class? There's a question that I'd like to ask you about your assignment. And then to go back and proceed to hand everybody else's papers back, and he comes up after class. This was at HBU. It would never happen here. He comes up to me after, with the attitude, right? Yes, you wanted to ask me about your paper? About my paper? Yeah, I did. Did you have any help in writing this paper? Well, what do you mean? I think you know. Have you ever heard of Sister Papouphany of the Sacred Heart and her work on the Apostle Paul? I don't know what you're talking about. Well, this would defy that claim, and just put both pages. Don't do that, okay? I mean, what that suggests to us is plagiarism. But in this case, when you're dealing with first century texts, and there is no such thing as what? Plagiarism, we shouldn't interpret it in the same way. Matthew, Mark, and Luke frequently admit of verbatim agreement. What does that adjective verbatim mean? Word for word. They admit a frequent verbatim agreement. This frequent verbatim agreement extends to unusual Greek grammatical constructions. Weird kind of turn of phrase, will be present in all three that seems unlikely unless somebody was using someone else. This frequent verbatim agreement will even extend to shared, unusual, or unique Old Testament quotations. All right, by the first century, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which we know as the Septuagint or the 70, the LXX, had normalized. At times, the synoptic writers will quote the Old Testament in Greek in a non-standard way, in a way that differs from the Septuagint. And that's suggestive. It suggests that, maybe Matthew got his quotation of this particular Septuagint passage from Mark or maybe from Luke. What about their differences? So you've got all these similarities between the synoptics. There are also synoptic dissimilarities, ways that they differ from one another. For instance, there are at times variations in content. Now, both Matthew and Luke have an infancy story. That's how they begin their Gospels, with an account of the circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth. They both talk about the infancy of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, but they don't do so in the same way. Even though they both have a birth account, they don't have the same birth account. Matthew has Jesus preach in chapters 5 through 7. Matthew has Jesus preach a sermon on what kind of geographical feature? A mount. Okay. A lot of the content, not all of it, but a lot of the content, maybe not even the preponderance of it, but still a big chunk of the content of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount reappears in Luke's Gospel in the Sermon on the... It's not like this anymore. This is a mount. This is a... No, that would be a valley. All right. No, this is a plain. Okay, so Luke has Jesus preach a sermon on the plain, and a lot of the content of the Sermon on the Plain admits of exact verbatim agreement with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, but there's a difference between this and this, right? This is a, and this is a, there's differences in content. In Luke's Gospel, he tells about the post-resurrectional appearances of Jesus to his disciples. And he mentions Jesus' appearance on the road to Emmaus, about Jesus, appearing to his disciples behind closed doors in Jerusalem. Then he ends with an account of his ascension to the Father from on top of the Mount of Olives. It's different in Matthew's Gospel. Certainly Jesus appears to his disciples post-resurrectionally, but nothing about the road to Emmaus. Instead, how does Matthew's Gospel end? With what famous passage? It's great now. Yeah, the Great Commission. All right. But you'll only find that in Matthew. In Mark, there is no post-resurrectional appearance of Jesus. So there's variations in content. There's also variations in arrangement. All of those materials, that you won't find from Matthew's Sermon on the Mount in Luke's Sermon on the Plain, you'll still find those materials in Luke, but they're kind of scattered all over the place. So sometimes, even when you have similar materials in the double tradition, they won't all appear in the same place. Now, all of these striking similarities and these subtle yet important differences have generated an issue for New Testament scholarship. It's called the synoptic problem. Now, don't let that word fool you, all right? Is that a good word or a bad word? It's a bad word? Okay, if that significant other in your life that you left back home, calls you towards the end of the semester and says, look, we've got a problem, then problem's a bad word, all right? But in your statistics class, if your professor gives you some homework and says, I want you to solve this problem before our next class session, that's just a task, right? It's a bad word? Okay, all right, well, it's just a task that you have to figure out. It's something that you need to solve in order for you to understand what you're dealing with a little bit better. That's how we're dealing with the word problem here. Okay, the synoptic problem. All of the striking similarities and the subtle differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke combine to suggest, all right, a literary dependency relationship between those three documents. That does not include John. Somebody was using somebody in the composition of these texts. Now, if we want to posit, an answer for the nature of that relationship, basically what we're talking about is a solution to the synoptic problem. It can be quite valuable knowing who used who for the sake of interpretation, and I hope to kind of demonstrate that. So there's 18 possible, if you ask a statistician, we got these three texts that exhibit these characteristics. What's the potential number of different ways that they could be related? There are 18 possible solutions to the synoptic problem. I'm not going to make you learn all of those. Instead, we're just going to look at 4 and narrow to 1 that's become kind of authoritative. The first, all right, is known as the Augustinian hypothesis. It's named after, it's been around a long time, all right, since around the year 400 CE. It's put together by St. Augustine. Any of you ever read St. Augustine's Confessions? Maybe the City of God? How many of you are humanities majors? Any humanities majors in here? All right, so as a humanities major, if you persist with this, your capstone class will involve reading, unless things change, St. Augustine's City of God. And it's very long. Yeah, get started on it now. You might be able to finish it by the time you're a senior. Okay, the Augustinian hypothesis, brainchild of St. Augustine, a very famous Christian. He suggested that Matthew was the first gospel composed. Okay, now on the exam, I might ask you to diagram various solutions to the synoptic problem, so you'll want to, get these diagrams out. According to St. Augustine, Matthew wrote first, then Mark used Matthew, had a copy of Matthew's gospel in front of him when writing his own account, and finally, Luke was the third of the synoptics composed and had access both to the text of Matthew as well as Mark. All right. Scholars these days kind of regard this as a pre-critical notion. St. Augustine, okay, it just so happens that the most popular early Christian gospel was Matthew. That's why Matthew appears first in the canonical ordering. And it's clear when you read what St. Augustine has to kind of say about this, it's clear that he was influenced by Matthew's early popularity. And these kinds of questions should not be resolved on the basis, it's not a popularity contest, okay? He really wanted, Matthew to be the first gospel, Mark to be the second, and Luke the third because of canonical ordering, but that's not scholarly. And as a consequence, scholars now regard his solution as pre-critical, but he still deserves credit for seeing the problem for what it was. And you'll be surprised how far your brain will carry you if you can just see the problem. If you can see the problem for what it is, that's the first step towards greatness right there. All right, when we come back next time, we'll talk about the second solution, the Griesbach hypothesis. Got an exam coming up before too terribly long. It's going to be great. All right.